If a crew of the Denver, South Park, and Pacific Railroad Gunnison Division didn't have a wreck or get off the track, it didn't consider the trip a success. The company hadn't put enough ballast on the narrow gauge line that snaked over the country's backbone 2 miles up in the Colorado Rockies. Some of the rails clung to steep mountainsides on shelves just wide enough to support them. And the roadbed wasn't kept up because the company didn't take in enough money hauling mining equipment and passengers to pay for much maintenance. In 1884, after 2 years of construction, it had completed the Alpine Tunnel at the altitude of 11,523 feet, a phenomenal engineering feat. The project was developed to conquer the last big hurdle between the eastern slope of the Continental Divide and the Pacific Ocean. The tunnel, timbered in redwood, was the first attempt to get rails across the Continental Divide, and the first railroad tunnel drilled in the United States. It was the highest elevation reached by any railroad anywhere, and was built with tremendous effort against bitter odds of extreme cold, severe wind, and mountain snows with primitive equipment. The train crews had 9 months of severe winter with tons of snow blocking the tracks, which more often than not were also covered with ice. Then there were 3 months of cold weather with porcupines and falling rocks to contend with. It all added up to some of the roughest railroading in the country in the early days, and it took real men to get by. Maybe the hardships were why we all got a kick out of the simple jokes the crew played on each other, like putting Limburger cheese under the boiler. It didn't take long to get rid of the awful smell, providing, of course, you could locate the cheese and clean it out. I got into railroading at the age of 18 as a callboy with the Santa Fe in Colorado Springs. That was early in 1906. The following Christmas Day, I went to work in the cinder pit helping the night engine watchman clean locomotives, shake down grates, and clean ash pans. In the spring of 1907, I was firing a switch engine. On October 8, 1908, I went to work out of Denver to Pueblo on the Santa Fe and Colorado Southern, in the days when their trains ran north and south on the Santa Fe tracks. Early in 1909, I was cut off the extra board in Denver and had no job. So I went to work on the South Park from Como, near the old mining town of Fairplay, and stayed in a place where the snow blew right through the brick walls. From Como, I worked toward Leadville and Gunnison. Later, I went on the board of the Santa Fe and worked on until 1914. After having fired a standard gauge, I had an awful time my first trip or two as a fireman on the South Park because of the difference in the size of the engine. The amount of coal I had to shovel was sure different. On the standard gauge between Denver and Colorado Springs, we used to strip down to our underwear, but you couldn't do that in such a cold altitude as the narrow gauge traveled. There were other differences, too. I thought it kind of unusual for Bert Whitney, an engineer I fired with on the fishing special from Denver to Grant, to wear clean white cotton gloves with his overalls and a white handkerchief in his pocket. Well, all the engineers in the South Park wore Panama hats in the winter just to be different. I'd never been concerned about porcupines, but they were sure thick along the South Park narrow gauge. It was against the law to kill them. I hit one once with only a light engine, no train, and stopped to make sure it was dead. It weighed a monstrous 50 pounds. Porcupines could be killed easily, and some people killed them for food, even if it was against the law. The most exciting part of the 10-mile road for crews and passengers alike was down the western slope from Alpine Station to Quartz Creek, where there was a narrow shelf just wide enough to support the rails. The Palisades was located 2 miles west of the tunnel, where trains made their way past a granite cliff over an extensive stone wall that had to be built to hold the rails. The wall is still there. Al Herbert was an engineer nicknamed Cigarettes, who was always up to playing a trick. On my first trip with him, we got to Hancock, where we were to switch with another engine. As we went by, a guy on the other engine hit Cigarettes with a snowball, and it stung. Cigarettes wadded waste paper and rags, soaked it in oil, and when we made a second pass, the guy who'd hit him with the snowball had his head hanging out of the window, just haw-hawing away. Cigarette's oily wad hit him right in the mouth.